Today I want to introduce you to your next assignment. This will also be your last assignment for the semester. Just a little background first. Many people use Illustrator only for very simple illustrations, charts, graphs, simple schematic illustrations where everything is filled in with just solid flat color. Many people don't seem to realize that Illustrator actually has some very powerful tools for creating a sense of three-dimensional form and even a sense of realism, almost to the point of being photorealistic. You just really have to master those tools, those 3D, I don't want to call them modeling tools, but 3D rendering tools. Things like object blends, gradients, the gradient mesh tool, and the new freeform gradient tool. If you really master those things, you can actually create artwork with a very high degree of 3D form and realism. So the purpose of this assignment is to force you to really push the limits of Illustrator and really learn those tools really well, so that if you ever do have a need to create something in Illustrator with a high degree of realism, that you have those tools at your disposal and you really know how to use those tools really well. So the assignment involves creating, there's different names for it. I usually refer to it as a zoo plate, thinking that this is the sort of thing that you might see printed on a sign next to an exhibit in a zoo or aquarium, showing a picture of the animal, its common name, its Latin name, and some interesting facts about the animal, and possibly even something showing its geographic location. So those are the elements that are required for this particular assignment. Number one, you're going to create a very highly detailed, realistic image of the animal. And to do that, you're going to work directly on top of a photographic reference. And I'll talk a little bit more about the photos in a few minutes. You're going to render the animal using whatever tools you think are going to work best. In this particular case, a lot of the elements of the grasshopper are created using gradient mesh. And now I'm not going to be able to get hold of it when I want to. Let's see, there we go. There's one large gradient mesh object to create the this portion of the outer shell of the grasshopper. And it looks like, yeah, there's another rather complex gradient mesh object here to create the head. The eye, I think, may actually be just a simple gradient. There are some smaller gradient mesh objects for even these small parts of the body. And see, yeah, there's another one. In the limbs, it looks like these may just be simple linear gradients in the limbs. But so a number of different tools, a lot of gradient mesh, some simple linear, possibly radial gradients. One of the other things that gives this grasshopper a high degree of realism is that a lot of things, even something that's fairly smooth and shiny, like the shell of an insect, will often have a little texture on it. And the texture on this shell is actually achieved just by copying and pasting hundreds and hundreds of these little objects. So if you were to select, this little cluster of objects, there's actually three things here. There's sort of a mid-tone highlight and almost like a little shadow on this one little object here. You can just grab that and hold the Option key down as you drag and replicate these things many times. And then there's obviously a smaller one here. You can drag that and replicate it many times. So even though there are hundreds and hundreds of these things, they're actually not that difficult to create fairly rapidly. In addition to this highly detailed rendering of the animal, I'd like something in the background. It doesn't necessarily have to be a highly realistic rendering of the background that's present in the photo that you use. You could make a somewhat more simplified background. I love this one here because that leaf, even though it's not super detailed, still has a sense of form. And then placing that cast shadow under the grasshopper really makes the grasshopper look like it's resting on this leaf. And if you look very closely towards the upper right, you can see that there's even another green shape back there, which kind of looks like it's another leaf or a blade of grass or something in the distance that's kind of blurry. So that's something that a lot of students will do too, is they'll use like one big gradient mesh object in the background to create sort of a blurry, out of focus version of whatever was in the background photo. In addition to the animal and the background, oh, by the way, one other comment about the animal. The animal is really the focal point of this illustration, so I want the animal to be as big as possible on the page. I want you to really fill the page with the animal. And these other elements, I want you to kind of fit them into the negative spaces around the animal. So one of the other elements that I want you to include is a map. And I'm going to go through a few different examples of student projects from the past and point out some maps that I think are very successful, some others that maybe aren't quite so good. I feel like this is a very successful map for a couple reasons. Number one, we're seeing enough of the country here that most people with sort of an average knowledge of geography are going to immediately recognize that as the United States. If you're illustrating an animal from a different part of the world, you may need to show enough of that region of the world that a lot of people would recognize. Of course, I realize that most people have pretty bad knowledge of geography, but we're assuming, a reasonably educated person who can look at a map of the world and pick out, Asia or Africa or something like that. And then you want to zoom in or narrow in and show the specific geographic distribution of the animal. And so this shows a very detailed representation of this grasshopper's specific geographic location here in the United States. You're going to want the common name of the animal, shown here prominently up at the top, the Latin name, and by convention in biology, Latin names are always in italics. And then you're going to want some interesting facts about the animal. It doesn't necessarily have to be a whole big paragraph. It could just be a few bulleted points, but a few interesting facts about its habitat, its behavior, what does it eat, and any unique features of the animal. You might also notice that the map utilizes some of the colors from the image itself. The yellow is obviously taken from the colors of the legs or the antenna. The green of the rest of the United States picked up from the leaf. And some of the colors up here for the common name and the Latin name are also picked up from the grasshopper itself. And that just gives the whole layout kind of a harmonious look. It kind of ties everything together. So let me show you some other examples. Here's one from last year. This really kind of bizarre ancient fish from the Amazon. The fish itself is really beautifully rendered, very highly detailed, nice sense of 3D form. I don't know if I can get hold of any part of, oh yeah. Very, very complex gradient mesh shape there. Another equally complex gradient mesh on the belly of the fish. Several others used for different parts of the head. And then I suspect that if you were to look closely at these scales, this is actually a fill pattern. Okay, that's the gradient mesh. There's actually, I think that's a fill pattern to show the repeating pattern of the scales, or just to give a little hint of the scales on top of that. So that's a common approach that students take, where they'll use a gradient mesh to capture sort of the underlying form and color of the animal. But then if there's a lot of texture, like scales or something, then they'll add that as separate objects right on top of the gradient mesh shape. The background is quite simple, but it's very effective. Just that green gradient in the background kind of gives you the feeling that this thing is underwater, maybe in some murky water. The map is really top notch. This is an excellent map. Again, anybody with a moderate knowledge of geography should immediately recognize that as South America. I love the fact that Faye shows us the entire Amazon River basin in one color, and then the specific range, the specific distribution of this kind of fish in a slightly different color. So it really just adds a lot of information to it. But it's a very detailed, very accurate map of this thing's distribution. we've got the common name up here, Latin name in italics, and then a bunch of facts about the animal. Once again, I think you can tell that there may have been some kind of light greenish color in the fin that Faye picked up for all of the text in the map, or excuse me, in the layout. By the way, one other comment about the layout. You're not limited to fonts in this particular project the way you were in the textbook illustration project. For the textbook illustration, I was very specific about using something like Arial or Helvetica, a simple sans serif font, only because my publishing clients are very specific about using those particular fonts, and I want you to get accustomed to the idea of following the guidelines from your client about things like font and so forth. For this particular project, you have a lot more leeway in your choice of fonts. You can use fonts that are more decorative or that somehow fit better with your overall layout and design. But I'm going to warn you about something. If you use some kind of oddball font that you find on your computer, or you go on the internet and you download some oddball font, you put it into your layout, when you submit this for me to review, there's a really good chance that I'm not going to have that same font, and so it's not going to show up properly on my computer. So after you've created all of your text, your common name, Latin name, and all of this other text, I want you to convert it to outlines. And let's double check and see if Faye... Oh, okay, now, as it turns out, made kind of a liar out of me that Faye's text is not converted to outlines. But let me just see, maybe that's a fairly common font. Well, I think Faye just got lucky that this is one that I happen to have on my computer. Whoops, didn't mean to do that. I'll try to point that out on some of the others to show that it is a good idea to select your text. In fact, since this is still actually text, it allows me to demonstrate this. Go up to the type menu and choose this command, create outlines. That converts the text into actual vector shapes. So now I no longer need to have that particular font installed on my computer in order to be able to actually view the text. So remember to convert to outlines, especially if you use some kind of oddball font. Another example from last year, another really excellent piece. The horseshoe crab has just a really stunning look to it. Real nice sense of 3 dimensions, but also, I mean, it has this kind of iridescent quality to it. But really, that's done by just doing a really good job of capturing. I don't know if I can get hold of this gradient mesh shape or not. I think there may be a clipping mask around this thing. There's also a lot of other little shapes for texture, so it's giving me a hard time actually trying to select the gradient mesh shape in the background. Maybe I have more luck back here. Well, I don't know. It's not letting me get hold of it. But there's a series of very complex gradient mesh shapes in there, and just by choosing the colors very carefully, it gives it that kind of iridescent appearance to it. And then you may have noticed while I was trying to select things that there were also lots of other little shapes here that are then superimposed on top of the big gradient mesh in the background, just to give it a little additional texture. The background behind the crab is relatively simple. I'm not exactly sure how Victoria did this. I'm guessing there's some sort of fill pattern in the background just to give it the appearance of sand. The map is another one that's really, really well done. The colors in the map kind of harmonize nicely with some of the colors in the crab. Again, you may need a little bit more knowledge of geography to recognize that this is Southeast Asia and the islands of the Western Pacific. Malaysia and so forth down here. But you can see how incredibly specific and detailed the map is. It really shows the geographic distribution in that light blue very, very precisely. So it's obvious that Victoria did a lot of research on this particular animal to find out the very precise geographic distribution of this animal so that she could draw this very accurate and very detailed map. Here's one by Sam Maida from a few years ago. This is a spectacular illustration, I think you can tell. And when I select different parts of it, you can see just these outrageously complex gradient mesh shapes, a whole bunch of them. Even the individual spines on this, what is this thing, like a lionfish? Yeah. Very, very detailed. And one thing I love about this is how the face is more in focus, and then the spines seem to be kind of out of focus. That was something that the photographer did in choosing their settings when they photographed the fish. But the way she used the gradient meshes in this image, it simulates that narrow depth of field and the blurriness of some of the spines. The background behind the spines is very simple. It's just a blue gradient, but it really makes the fish look like it's in the water. This map down here is pretty good. I mean, I think most people will recognize that part of the world. Because it's a fish and it lives in the ocean, it's free to, you know, move around. It's not like it's limited to one island or something like that, or one continent. It's free to move throughout the Indian Ocean and the western part of the Pacific Ocean. So it has a much more broad range that's a little bit less defined than some of the other examples I showed, but I suspect this is probably still, you know, a very accurate representation of its geographic distribution. Nice job with the text up here. She didn't put the common name front and center. The common name is embedded here within the within the paragraph, but that's okay. She focused mainly on the Latin name. Now, the only thing I'm not crazy about here is that the Latin name is not italicized, because that's just standard procedure in the life sciences. This particular one, this snail, has just unbelievable rendering on this shell. If I select the shell, you can see how just ridiculously complex that gradient mesh is. And you can tell how the gradient mesh is extending way out beyond the edge of the shell, so there must be a clipping mask object. If I can get hold of it, yeah, that's probably a clipping mask that's placed around the outside of that gradient mesh to get it to conform to the shape of the shell. And then this next part of the shell is another really complex gradient mesh, also with a clipping mask around it. And then there's a series of additional ones, each one inside of its own clipping mask to define the outside shape of it. So really incredibly detailed work. The rest of the snail down here is a lot more simple. There's really just one big shape back there with a single color in it, but then a whole bunch of smaller shapes that appear to be gradients, just simple radial gradients, and just a whole lot of them replicated over and over again with slightly different shapes. One thing that makes the foot of this snail look so convincing, though, it really has this kind of shiny, slimy look. It's just the placement of these specular highlights on top of those radial gradients. And these are just literally little white shapes, just little ovals and things filled in with white. But for, zoomed out like this, it's extremely convincing. Background here is really simple. This one may be a little too oversimplified. There's really just a cast shadow under the snail and then this simple green gradient. The map is well done, although I'm going to point out something about it that's a little odd. It's clearly Western Europe, or actually all of Europe. And I like how she's identified the different countries. I'm guessing that she found some verbal description of the snail's geographic location and found that the snail lives in all of these particular countries. What surprises me is that the snail seems to recognize geopolitical boundaries, and even though it lives in Poland, Finland, and Russia, it doesn't dare set foot in Latvia, Lithuania, or Estonia, or whatever this one is. I don't know if it's Belarus or one of the former Soviet countries. Um, so it's interesting that it's distributed in all of these other countries, but it won't go in here. Um, that's not that big a deal, but I'd rather have a little bit more precise map of its location. I really doubt that it lives all throughout Poland, but then it won't cross that boundary for whatever reason. This one's really very dramatic. I love the extreme close-up on the crab. One thing that this really illustrates is how this particular student really filled up the available space with the animal. I mean, she made this crab really, really big. So it's clearly the predominant feature on the page. And I mean, she made it so big that it extends right off the edges of the page. And I think that's fine. I mean, I would rather you made the animal really big so we get a real close-up of it, even if part of it gets cut off or cropped off on the edges. It really makes for a dramatic image too, where it's so big. It's also, it's not dead center. It's tilted at a really interesting angle. So it's just a very visually captivating image. I love how the map utilizes colors from the crab's body. The Latin name and the common name down here also pick up colors from the crab's body. Really helps tie the whole layout together. Now, this particular map, again, it's a very well done map. It's clearly Central and South America. I do wonder about the geographic distribution, though. Maybe I'm wrong, but I find it a little hard to believe that this thing is found, up here in the Caribbean and, around Panama and other parts of Central America. And yet it's also found way down here at the Straits of Magellan, down at the southern tip of Argentina and Chile. I mean, because that's really, really cold. So an extreme range of climate and temperature here. Maybe it's true. Maybe it really does live all the way around the entire coast of South America and even up into parts of the Caribbean. My guess is that, once again, the student had just some text description that said, lives on the coast of South America and the Caribbean islands, without getting into any more detail than that. So at this point, maybe you're recognizing that, I really want you to find as much detail as you can about the animal, particularly about its geographic distribution, so you can make your map as detailed and accurate as possible. Ideally, when you're researching your animal to try to find your photograph that you're going to use, you really should spend some time looking to find, as much detail as you can about the geographic location. And by the way, I make this comment right in the assignment sheet, but it bears repeating that you really need to find all of this additional information when you're choosing your animal. You may find a beautiful photograph that you absolutely want to illustrate, but if you can't find the geographic location, if you can't find the scientific name of the animal, if you can't find some interesting facts, you really have to pick a different animal. In the assignment sheet, I give some suggestions for different kinds of animals that you might want to consider illustrating. I generally recommend you choose things that are relatively smooth and ideally things that are colorful. Reptiles and amphibians, a lot of people pick things like tree frogs because they have smooth bodies and they're very brightly colored. Certain kinds of salamanders and things. Crustaceans, like we saw that beautiful picture of a crab. You have smooth shells or relatively smooth shells, or maybe a little texture on them. Insects, a lot of fish, anything that has, a relatively smooth body. Maybe there's some texture, like some fish scales, but often you can do that just by superimposing some tiny little shapes on top of a gradient mesh. In the past, I never recommended that students illustrate anything that's covered with fur or feathers. Um, Something like a penguin would be fine. I mean, even though technically it's got feathers, they're all completely smooth, and so you don't really see the individual feathers. But something like this animal here, completely covered with shaggy fur, I just can't imagine how much time it took the student to do this. I have had a few students over the past few years who did decide to really just, push the limits and try to render something with fur. And if I select this thing, you'll see how just unbelievably complex this image is. I mean, there's some crazy complex gradient meshes in the background, but then these individual hairs. I mean, every one of these hairs is a separate vector shape. Now, some of the students who've chosen to do animals covered with fur have told me that they used a vector application on their iPad that actually made it quicker and easier for them to draw the vector shapes. And then once they were done rendering it on the iPad, then they brought it into Adobe Illustrator to add things like the background, the map, and the text and so forth, and to put the whole layout together. Off the top of my head, I don't remember what that program was that they used on the iPad, but there is a vector program available for iPad that is compatible with Illustrator, so you could do some of that rendering on the iPad and then bring it into Illustrator. If you really want to try something with fur, you're welcome to give it a shot, but just recognize just how incredibly time-consuming it's going to be. These also end up being enormous files. I did post this one for you as a sample on my courses. I believe it's 131 megabytes, which is huge for an Illustrator file. All right, so now that I've given you an overview of what I'm expecting for the assignment, let me just give you a few pointers about how to approach the assignment. And first, I'm going to open up the photograph of this shark in Photoshop, just so I can give you an idea of the parameters that you want when you're choosing your photo. So the photo itself has to be very large. It either needs to be large dimensions or very high resolution or some combination thereof. If I go to image size, you'll see that this is a low resolution image. It's only 72 pixels per inch, but it's 22 inches in width, which means that it's twice the width of my standard 8.5 by 11 page, which is the size I'm going to be working at. So I could go in here to resample, turn off the resample box, and if I reduce the width down to 11 inches, because I've turned off resample, the resolution jumps up to 145. I could then turn resample back on. I could reset this resolution to something more typical, like 150. And so now I've got something that's, is going to fit in an 8.5 by 11 page, and it's 150 pixels per inch, which that should be adequate resolution for me to be able to redraw this. But the image just needs to be large enough, and it needs to be sharp enough, crisp enough, that you can actually see a fairly high level of detail in the image so that you can replicate it in Illustrator. I really don't want out of focus, blurry photographs. I don't want you to download a photo that's the size of a postage stamp and think that you're going to be able to replicate that with a high level of detail, at 8.5 by 11 inch size. Let me make a few more comments about the photos before we go back to Illustrator and I show you how to get started on the project. You're going to be drawing right over the top of an existing photo, which means that you are copying a photo. And you're going to be obtaining these photos from the internet. And so the photos that you're going to be downloading off of the internet were obviously, taken by somebody else. And so legally, the copyright to those photos belongs to the photographer. And if you redraw somebody else's photo, you are technically infringing their copyright. You are making a copy of their work without authorization. And those of you who've been to art school, you may have had some teachers tell you that, oh, you can modify somebody else's artwork by a certain amount, a certain percentage or something, and then call it your own. And really, there's absolutely no truth to that idea at all. If you copy somebody else's work, even if you redraw it in a completely different medium, like redrawing it in Illustrator, you are still infringing that person's work. This is okay for our purposes because you're creating something just for the educational experience. You're not planning on reselling the work. You're not planning on publishing or distributing the work in any way. Although you may have to be cautious about putting the work up on your website as part of your portfolio, because that could be considered a form of distribution or publication. So it's conceivable that the original photographer could try to come after you and sue you for copyright infringement, or at very least make you take it off of your portfolio. So in order to avoid infringing someone else's copyright when you create this project, it's probably best if you try to find images that you can utilize that are not protected by copyright. That would mean going into Wikipedia, for example. The images that are viewed on Wikipedia are part of something called the Wikimedia Commons, which means these are things that have been placed not really into the public domain, but they've been placed online for people to freely use without any copyright restrictions. So you're free to use the images from Wikimedia Commons without worrying about any copyright repercussions. You might also try to find images that are placed online through the US government, because everything that the US government does belongs to the American people, because it was all paid for with US tax dollars. So illustrations created by people who work for the US government are automatically in the public domain. That would also include photographs. So a lot of US government websites will have copyright-free or royalty-free photos that you could use. So for insects and things, you might go to maybe the US Department of Agriculture or the Smithsonian Department of Entomology or something like that. See if they have collections of photos available that you can use. So try to find some kind of copyright-free, royalty-free, public domain photo that you can utilize. In the real world, if you couldn't find a photo like that, you'd have two choices. You'd either have to get your own photo reference, which, trying to get your own photo reference of this shark would be a pretty involved process, or you'd have to actually get written permission from the copyright owner to make a replica, make a copy of their photo. So generally speaking, it's best to find some kind of royalty-free thing that you can utilize. All right, so we're going to go back into Illustrator. And what I've done here is I've created an 8.5 by 11 image in Illustrator. I placed the photo onto a layer and locked it so I can't accidentally pick it up. And then I'm going to create additional layers to begin my illustration. One of the biggest mistakes that a lot of students make when they start this project is they assume that they have to create a single outline that goes around the outside of the entire animal. And I can tell you right now that there's absolutely no point in doing this. Let me show you why. I'm going to select this outline that I've already drawn. I'm going to get rid of its stroke color. I'm going to give it a fill color that I'll just pick from here. And let's say that I want to try to create the body of this shark using gradient mesh. I'm going to create some separate videos for you that show you how these different tools work. So if you don't follow what I'm doing, don't worry about it. I'll try to teach you more about these different tools. But I've grabbed the gradient mesh tool from the toolbar, and I'm going to click on the edge of the shark here. And what this does is it creates what's called a mesh line, or a grid line, that goes across the body of the shark. And I could create a series of these that run more or less vertically, from the top of the shark to the bottom of the shark. And these don't look too bad. I mean, you might notice there's some little squiggles in these lines, but they're not horrible. But if I click on one of these lines now right in the middle, it's going to try to create one that's roughly horizontal, running the length of the shark. And now you can see that some really weird things are happening. There's this S-shaped squiggle up here. I don't know how well you can see this, but part of the gradient mesh actually goes outside the edge of the shark. If I add one more of these, it's probably going to get even worse. Okay, now there's a real crazy one. It's trying to come out here and follow the edge of this fin, and then it zigzags around back here, following the edges of these other fins. What's happening here is that I've got an object that is just so complex in its outline that when I try to turn this entire object into a gradient mesh, it's really trying very hard to follow that very complex outline of the shape. And it's just going to produce something that's a complete nightmare. When you work with gradient mesh, the idea is that you create these mesh points and then you give them different colors. So let's see what happens if I colorize one of these mesh points a different color. Yeah, we're getting some just craziness going on here. It's going to be essentially impossible to control the gradient mesh and actually render the shark the way I want it to. So I'm going to undo all of this. I'm going to hide that layer, and let me show you a better way to approach this. You really need to look at your animal and see if you can find natural separations between objects and divide the animal up into component shapes. So when I look at this shark, I'm seeing essentially one big shape that defines the head and the body all the way back to the tail. But that's one relatively simple shape. And then the dorsal fin, the pectoral fin, some of these pelvic fins back here, the tail, those would all be separate shapes. And each of those would be relatively simple. I mean, the dorsal fin you can see is just a simple triangle. The pectoral fin is just a really long, skinny triangle, essentially. In fact, all of these fins are just basically triangular shapes. So those are things that I could render separately. So I'm going to divide the body up into component shapes. And so now I've got one big shape here for the head and body. It's got a little bit of wiggliness to it, but it's far simpler than what I had before. I've even made a separate shape for the lower jaw, just because that separation between the upper part of the mouth and the lower part of the mouth, if I actually tried to, have a line that came in here, followed the edge of the mouth, and then went back around, that would be too complex, and I'd get weird effects with the gradient mesh. So I'm actually going to create a separate object for the lower jaw, and then I'll place that behind the other one. The pectoral fin here is a different shape. I've divided the tail fin into a couple different shapes, and then every other fin is separate. You may find that you need to subdivide your animal into a lot of different shapes. So let me just pick any one of these. I'm going to pick the body shape. And I had already created, what did I do with them? Well, I thought I had created some colored swatches. Oh, I see what I did. I put them on a different layer. Let me bring those down here. So I've got some colored swatches that I created, one for the dark kind of grayish blue on the dorsal surface of the shark, This light one is actually the color from underside the snout of the shark here. There'd be, other lighter shades of blue-gray, almost going to fully white here around the mouth. So I mean, you could create some swatches initially for different parts of your animal. I'm going to fill this entire body shape with that kind of blue-gray color. And now I'm going to go back to my gradient mesh tool and start adding some mesh lines. And I'm going to click on the edge of the shape. It adds a mesh line here. Let me change the color of that outline so you can see it better. And it's still got some squiggles and wiggles to it because it's still trying to follow the overall contour of the shape, but I think it's going to be less complex than what we had before. I'm going to put another one over here. All right, now that one's really kind of weird because it's going, it's such a sharp angle, diagonally across the shark. I'll show you a little trick here. If I hold down the Shift key while I have my gradient mesh tool selected, I can click right on one of these mesh points and I can drag it, theoretically, drag it along the edge. Okay, it's behaving oddly, but I guess we'll leave it like that. I can do that up here as well. I can hold Shift and drag this along the edge of the shark. Let me add another mesh line here. The mesh lines also have these handlebars that can allow you to change their angle and direction. That one's not working that great. All right, let me finally add a horizontal mesh line going from the snout towards the tail. Let me try it back here. That's better. So you can see how I can use these handlebars to reposition different parts of the mesh line. I can also use that trick where I hold down Shift, drag this down along that point. I can then move this point over now. I can drag this down. Once again, use some of my mesh lines to reposition things. And one thing I know is I need to add some mesh lines up here near the front because this is where I start to get to a different color, for the snout of the shark. I've created a new point here. Let me go and grab my eyedropper, and I'm going to pick up that light color that I made before. And I'm going to also select these points that are right on the edge of the shark's snout. And once again, use eyedropper to pick up that color. And so you can see how I can start to create one color for the underside of the snout of the shark and a different color, it transitions seamlessly to a different color on the top of the head. I can continue to use that trick where I hold down the Shift key and slide mesh points along the edge of the path just to reposition where that white color is. I can pull this line down. That's going to pull the darker gray down. Same thing here. So I can begin to restrict that white color to the area on the underside of the snout. Now, one thing that's challenging here is that I can't see my photograph anymore. There's a couple ways you could approach that. You could actually duplicate, oops, do that. You could duplicate your photo and have one version that you're drawing from, and then another version, I'll send that to the back, where I can see the actual photograph for reference. And one thing that I can tell is that boundary between the gray on the top of the snout and the white on the underside is actually a much sharper boundary. So I may need to actually pull these points closer together so that there's a much more abrupt transition from the gray color to the white color. The closer you pull those mesh points together, the more of an abrupt transition you get. So here's what I came up with after working on this for a little while. I've got this body color, and you can see I still need to do some more work back here on it. I haven't really addressed anything back here in the tail region. I've got a separate object that I created for the lower jaw, and I don't know why that got moved up there. Oh, I see. I've got a couple different ones here actually that I've got a different version of the body. Oh, I see. That's way up there. All right. Put that back. Let me get rid of the new one that I just created. All right. So you see this other version that I had done for a previous demo. I actually did start to do some stuff back here in the tail of the shark. So I've got the lower jaw. I've got something with little detail in the mouth, just showing the individual teeth. Relatively simple, but zoomed out, it actually doesn't look too bad. I overlaid some texture, some detail around the face and the nose, and starting to get a little bit of texture. I think this might be a tiger shark, so it's almost got this striped appearance. And then started working a little bit on the eye. So that's the basic approach to this assignment in Illustrator. And as I said, I'll be posting some additional videos showing how to work with gradient mesh, gradients, object blends, and things like that. All of the different tools that you'll need to create this thing in 3D. So that's it.